Welcome to Open Minds, a Freedom of Thought podcast series, interviewing the people who bring courage and independent thought to the challenges of today.
So Matt Stoller, welcome back. I want to transition now from antitrust fundamentals to the present situation and connect our discussion with the subject of this podcast, which is freedom of thought. Let me start with this question. There are some things you know when you feel them. You know when you're having fun, you know when you're in love, and you know when you're free. I know that for myself, there's a pervasive sense of being unfree in American society today. I think a lot of people share that feeling. I'll go out on a limb and say that I assume you at least recognize what I'm talking about, maybe share the feeling yourself.
No, everything's great. I don't know why you're so whiny.
I'm wondering if your angle on consolidations of private power, the antitrust dilemma, the things that you've been examining in connection with your book and your recent writing, if it gives you a certain perspective on what has caused us to be so unfree. What are the roots of unfreedom in American society today?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'd say we're unfree in the same way that you would be unfree in, say, China, right? I think that there are gradations. We're not living in an authoritarian society, but there are deeply authoritarian trends that we should be worried about. And I think that it's coming from the commercial sector. America was a much more informal place in the 1970s. And, you know, there are just 1,000 ways that a little bit of freedom is taken from you every day. So, you know, 20 years ago, if you had a problem with the product you bought, you could call up a company and there would be somebody who would answer. Today, you call up and it's like a phone tree. That's very annoying. And you just go through that phone tree and maybe you get it dealt with and maybe you don't. And that's a change in my lifetime that I remember. And I think you can see, you know, the number of just junk fees, right? Where you're charged a resort fee for when you reserve a hotel, or, you know, random baggage fees, or like just lots of nickel and diming that didn't necessarily used to happen. And just things are harder now, right? There's just more bureaucracy, and it's private bureaucracy. It's private red tape. This isn't government. It's not like you're going to the DMV for stuff. It's just that it's harder and harder and harder to interact with your doctor or your cable company or whatever it is. And that's you know, and let's say you're a small business person, right? Let's say you're a pharmacist. It's or a doctor, something like this. Much harder to interact with the institutions that control your professional life. The pharmacy benefits manager that manages the pricing that you get, or an insurance company that reimburses you, or there are, and this is true in kind of in every aspect of American life. It's just harder and harder to deal with these distant masters. And I think that's like that's the creeping power that controls us is more and it's like more and more distant. And it's not that the people that are wielding that power are malevolent. They're not. They're just not near us, right? And it used to be that you'd have the people that control the commercial institutions were by and large like lived in the same places that used those institutions. And that's no longer the case. And increasingly, you know, the decisions about our world are being made in Washington, D.C. or Beijing or London or San Francisco. Just a small number of cities that are making decisions for all of us. And that's a crazy way to run a society. There's just what I think this concept in the 19th century concept called absentee ownership. It is just sort of writ large, where like the people that are, no one is in charge of the institutions on which we rely effectively. Like Mark Zuckerberg is running or Google, they're running like these systems that for billions of people, and maybe they're doing their best, but like you got 24 hours in a day and you got 3 billion people on your system. Even if 0.01% of the people on your system are having a serious problem, that might seem really small to you. Like, well, good, we've constrained it to 0.01% of the people on our system are having this problem. That's still a huge number of people. There is no, like Mark Zuckerberg talks about Facebook as a community, and it's like, it's crazy to talk about its system with 2 or 3 billion people on it as a community. That isn't that is the creeping bureaucratization of American life. It's very Soviet, and it's because we've consolidated power in the commercial sector. And like, we're not necessarily seeing it because we're mad at our government, but it's like, what's decentralizing the planners? The centralizers are at Amazon or at Lockheed Martin or at JP Morgan. And it's like, look to them. Those are the Soviets. Those are the bureaucrats that are controlling things. And the increasing bureaucratization of our life is happening because of those entities. So that's where I think the feeling of unfreedom and alienation is coming from.
So that's fascinating, and I can intuit your the sense you're speaking of, the sense of powerlessness that comes when, T-Mobile overcharges me in a way I think is wrongful, and I'm trying to get it fixed, and I'm constantly working my way through phone trees. Maybe I get it fixed or not, but it seems purely at their discretion. If I get really worked up, I can sue, but I can't sue, I have to arbitrate. I mean, I feel like your analysis is shedding light on that experience, and it's really interesting. But let me sound a skeptical note as well. Much of what contributes to my sense of being free and the people with whom I'm regularly interacting, my students, for example, doesn't seem consistently economic. It seems more ideological. So let me make a distinction here. For some people, they can't find good work or support their family or deal with debt, and they are unfree in a way that is paradigmatically economic. They're unfree because they can't make enough money or put themselves in good enough economic situations. For me and others in my more fortunate economic situation, there's a kind of oppression that has more to do with ideological, interpersonal, and institutional patterns. So the way I experience it is there's a set of political attitudes and taboos primarily associated with the progressive left. Interestingly, not the economic left, not where you expend your efforts and live your intellectual life primarily. It's a left that's primarily concerned with identity, with sort of culture war symbolism. These things used to be called identity politics and political correctness. Now it's called the woke movement. And this movement has incredible cultural and institutional power. So if you challenge the premises, you find yourself not just facing disagreement within your university or your law firm or your hospital or whatever, or for that matter, your school board or something, but you find yourself facing enmity, moral condemnation, and ostracism. And if you just sort of recognize the extent to which human beings are social creatures who want the esteem of their fellows, those things are really damaging. It's also institutional. So, we all live in the context of various institutions. I work for Northwestern, and I'm part of a HOA with my townhouse. And I send my kids to a private school, and the private school has an institutional structure. And I assume you work for a think tank and have a series of institutions that you're part of as well. And a certain ideology becomes pervasive in those professional settings where we work and live out our lives. And there are real consequences there where you can be sort of fired or disciplined, or again, just find your personal and professional esteem and opportunities vanishing. So when I look out at this sphere, it seems to have some economic relationships, but it's not primarily an economic phenomenon. It's an ideological phenomenon and a cultural phenomenon, which is depriving us of freedom. So tell me, am I missing something here? Are there ways in which this is all downstream from economic power in ways I'm not seeing?
Well, I just don't make the distinction between economic and cultural power. Like, I don't think economics is about resources and culture is about how we live. I think about political economy. So, how we choose to use resources is one aspect of it, but power is another aspect of it. And let me just talk about sort of that general, the problem of, I think DEI, ESG, like the diversity, equity, inclusion, the mechanisms of corporate governance, and I think that the general institutional approach to managing social relationships that I think conservatives are particularly sensitive to, but it's not purely conservatives, and there's a sort of general sense this is coming from the left. And I kind of want to talk about this in the context of monopoly, because I think it is a monopoly problem. I think it is downstream from market power.
That's key. So you think it's these cultural phenomena are not distinct from economics because they're downstream from market power and they're a monopoly phenomenon. I just want to highlight that because I think it's important for you, illuminating my experience, because I don't think of them as in that way.
Right. No. And so if you think about, so think about like ESG investing, right? So we're only going to invest in companies that do have certain values or goals. Well, this is implemented through a small network of institutions on Wall Street. So asset management is this category. It only probably had $100 billion there were only $100 billion of assets under professional management in the early 80s. Today, it's like $100 trillion. So a company like BlackRock, run by Larry Fink, they don't own, but they manage the assets of so many people that they control 5 to 10% of every public company in America. And a lot more than that, but that's enough power for now. So they have the ability to make important social choices about how every public company organizes itself. That is, you want to Sovietize something. That is Soviet, right? The ability of that and that's done under the argument of efficiency. Well, passive asset management, it's more efficient to have larger institutions. So you have BlackRock and Vanguard, and that, I forget the third one for some reason, that have just immense control over how corporations operate. But that's just only part of it. You've seen the number of public corporations has declined by roughly half since the 1990s. So there used to be around 7,000 or 8,000 public companies. Today there's around 3,500. There's not even 5,000 companies for the Wilshire 5,000 anymore. And that's largely because of mergers, because of lax antitrust policy. And so you just have fewer companies, and those companies are bigger. And so when a company makes a social determination, whether it's something that the left doesn't like or the right doesn't like, they just are making important social choices. So Disney, for example, a lot of conservatives got really mad at Disney because of some of the choices in their movies and various other political lobbying. Disney is, different than it was in the 1980s. Disney bought a bunch of companies. They just used to make movies and they had some theme parks. Now they have a huge market share in movies because they bought up a bunch of competitors. They're also a big company in television, and they're a huge distributor. They've essentially recreated the studio system of the 1950s, except they've consolidated television and movies, and they're global. So they have huge relationships in China as well. You get mad at them and you're like, okay, they have a lot of social power, but they have a lot of social power because of the consolidation that they pursued. And so you can say, well, this is a DEI thing, but if they didn't have the power over over the distribution as well, then they couldn't they'd have to make movies that audiences wanted to see, and they'd have to actually enter into markets to do that. Now it's just like the distribution and the production are one. So
let me make sure I understand.
That's true for Netflix. It's true for Amazon as well.
So the thought is that, after the...
Well, I apologize. I didn't get into like the main explanation, and I realize my answer was a little bit too long. But let me just say, so what happened in the 1970s and 80s, and this is something, there was a sociologist named Frank Dobbin who wrote about this. It was a book called Inventing Equal Opportunity. Effectively, as the country deunionized in the 70s and 80s and 90s, which was part of the law and economics movement, you saw the implementation of the civil rights movement era laws through HR networks in corporations. And what effectively happened, what DEI is it's a civil rights movement when ordinary people have no power, right? And so if you don't have any power because you can't join a union, or you don't have any ability to fight back against a big company using antitrust law because your private rights of action have been taken away, or arbitration, or any number of mechanisms that have been used to strip power from ordinary people, then, how do you create some sort of egalitarian system in that world, like where your ordinary baseline power as a worker, as a citizen, is just gone. Well, I think that's what, there's been this kind of focus on, well, the grievance part, the marginalized part of your identity is the only way that you can claim power. And we've built up a whole set of HR networks within corporations that are increasingly dominant. And that is the way that we have instrumentalized this kind of mechanism of egalitarianism. But that egalitarianism, there was always sort of two parts of the civil rights movement. One part was saying we need to diversify elites. And the other part was saying we need to diversify, we need to redistribute power so that it was a not entirely a class-based argument, but it was saying, like the New Deal, the white picket fence, Black people don't have that. They should get entree to that, where broad sort of bit of everybody has a little bit of property, right? That the American dream, that's been denied to Black people, and they should have access to that. And that was like that was the fundamental basis of the civil rights movement. That changed in the 1970s and 80s to, okay, we have to diversify elites. As corporations consolidated, as we got rid of, and I don't mean to say like unions are the only answer, but there were a whole series of labor protections. Like I think of patents as a labor protection for the engineer, and copyright as a labor protection for the artist, and farm supports as the labor protection for the farmer. And all of these have been inverted to make them protection for the big corporation. Well, what does it look like when you're trying to have a society where you get rid of racial discrimination, which I think we all agree would be is a critical part of living in a democracy? Well, what does it look like when you take everyone's rights away, like everyone's economic and political rights away for big business? How do you maintain some semblance of egalitarianism? And I think that this model of saying we're going to impose social egalitarianism from above, from these HR networks in these dominant corporations, that's what people hate, because it's fundamentally not about creating an egalitarian society, equal political rights and opportunities. It's about imposing a vision of social equality, which, whether you agree with it or not, should not be imposed upon people. I don't think most people disagree with the premise of having a society where people are treated equally and are not discriminated against based on their race or gender or sexual orientation. In general, that's a very small number of people that believe that that's a bad thing. But the idea of having that imposed upon you by a political and economic elite, and you have no power as a citizen, that is, I think, what people are rejecting. And that is what we have the civil rights movement, what happened to the civil rights movement when we decided to get rid of unions. That's what we are looking at right now. And I think that's why it's so hard for conservatives to address this problem without looking like out of touch or uncaring about people who are discriminated against, because they can't essentially figure out a way to empower sort of the little guy. They can't break from their libertarian priors and say, let's empower everyone. They have to find an anti-woke framework instead of recognizing, well, there's a lot of racism in this country, and institutional, I mean like embedded in the laws, and we have to address that. But we have to address it by empowering everyone. It's like you can't do that through libertarianism. You just can't, right? There is a way to bring back that original sense of what the civil rights movement was about, which is about redistributing power. But you have to want to redistribute power to do that.
So this is so interesting. I'm still a little skeptical, but let me try to summarize my understanding of what you just said and then raise another skeptical doubt. You know, after the George Floyd killing, I was really struck at all the political messaging at Netflix and Amazon Prime. You know, just when you go to watch TV in the evening, there was these companies that are selling to all Americans, right? Essentially all Americans, were making it very clear that they were on the side of the BLM movement and were expressing views as corporations that at least some of their customers greatly disagreed with, even offended by. And I thought, why are they able to side with one side of a great cultural and political conflict in society without suffering dire market consequences? You know, and people, their customers leave, their customers go elsewhere. And I guess your analysis is they've just got too much market power. Their customers don't have anywhere else to go for good TV. There's Netflix and Amazon and Disney and HBO, and they're all on the same side, essentially. And there's only about 4 of them, or maybe 5 or 6, but not enough that you would have a genuine alternative as a customer. And I guess it's the same analysis with Larry Fink at BlackRock. Larry Fink, BlackRock, because of really important developments in our publicly traded corporations, few companies like Vanguard and BlackRock have come to hold a vast portion of the shares of publicly traded companies. So BlackRock holds 5 to 10% of, I think, virtually every publicly traded company, which means the person in charge of BlackRock, Larry Fink, and the people around him who largely agree with him can impose a political vision without suffering competitive consequences for it. So as I understand it, that's your kind of market antitrust analysis of the predominance of progressive political values in the corporate sector. And I suppose there was one more really important part to your analysis, and I want to make sure I pull on this thread as well, which is that when you've got a sort of oligarchic private sector with billionaires and massive companies with huge wealth and very little competition that are still nominally committed to a kind of egalitarian vision, it works for them to accomplish their egalitarian vision by insisting in a top-down manner, not on empowering the people who they deal with, not on actually sharing power, but on promoting a social egalitarian message from above, essentially propagandizing for progressive values. Have I got you right? Have I sort of summarized the pieces of the puzzle as you see it?
I mean, mostly. I'm not sure I totally. I want to offer like one point. When you said, like, you started by saying Netflix or Amazon are selling to the public, and I think that choice of that word is important, because Netflix and Amazon and Disney are not selling to the public. That's what's important to understand. And there's a lot of conservatives think that these companies are putting progressive-oriented content in front of people. And I will ask them, I mean, I don't agree with that, but like, let's just say that that's true. And their one argument is, okay, well, they're doing it. And I'm like, I ask, why do you think they're doing that? And the argument is, well, because they are progressives themselves, and they're willing to forego profits in order to message on values that they care about.
Or they just lose very few profits because they have so much market power.
I'll get to that in a second. And I'll say, like, have you ever met a Hollywood executive? Like, they love money, right? They're not foregoing profits because, for their own values. This is not how Hollywood works. Like, Amazon doesn't forego money. I mean, it's the biggest company, one of the most valuable companies in the world. Like, these are not operating for charity purposes. The point is, they're not selling. They've destroyed markets. So it used to be, it's a vertical integration problem, which is when a supplier owns its customer. So it used to be that Amazon wouldn't do, but the movie studios made movies. Because of an antitrust case in the 1940s, the movie studios were not allowed to own the distribution. And this was true in TV, and a little bit later in 1970, there were financial syndication rules saying networks couldn't own the TV shows that they were distributing. So what happened is that created markets. And a movie studio would make a movie. They would go to theaters. They would have to convince the theaters to carry those movies. And then people would either see the movie or not. And the same thing is true. You'd make a show. You'd have to convince the TV network to carry it. And they would carry it or not. And then the advertisers would buy in if it was successful or not. If it wasn't successful, it would get killed. So there was this relationship between the audience and the studio that was based on open markets, where you would transact. You want to see a movie, you pay your money to see that movie. Okay, now today you open up Netflix or Amazon and they will just put things in front of you. And they are trying, the strategy there is, we'll get you to subscribe. Amazon's strategy is a little bit different, but it's essentially very similar. You will pay us a certain amount of money every month, and we will acquire market power, and then we will cram down the suppliers, like the companies that make the shows. Will reduce their compensation. We'll reduce the compensation of the talent, which is what's happening all over Hollywood. And then we will put things in front of you and hope that you watch them. And you won't have to pay for anything directly. And so they've effectively destroyed the feedback loop, the markets that made sure that the audience was getting the culturally relevant stuff that they wanted. So in the 1970s, to take a left-wing spin on this, in 1970, the Nixon FCC said, we're not going to let TV networks own the shows that they put in prime time. And what happened is you had a whole bunch of producers who could now go to the television networks and say, here's an idea for a show. And if you don't buy it, CBS, we're going to go to ABC and they're going to buy it. And so you had you had shows like All in the Family, this was 70s, 80s, 90s, The Cosby Show, Merrily Tyler Moore Show, like the first shows with gay characters, black characters. And they resonated with the public because they were true, and they were, Archie Bunker was like conservative, right? Like kind of racist guy. Like that resonated with the public. It was, the audience got what they wanted, and the unpopular stuff was killed off, and the popular stuff did well. And it's because there was this open market system that we was structured with rules, and that was true for the studio system, which we broke in the 1940s. Well, what happens when you get rid of those prohibitions against vertical integration? All of a sudden, and you've had huge consolidation, movie theater chains. So now you release all your movie, you don't release it into a couple of theaters and then word of mouth picks it up, which is how movies used to be released. Now it's like goes into 4,000 theaters all at once. And then it goes onto these streaming platforms. There are effectively no markets anymore for this cultural content. So what we have is a massive studio system, which is exactly what we had in the 1940s, except bigger, and it includes television. It's not a surprise that when you centrally plan this kind of cultural production and you don't have any feedback loops, what the stuff that gets produced is just the random instincts of the people in Hollywood who are trying to make money, who are trying to relate to their audience, but they don't have any feedback loops anymore. The markets are broken, and that's what the problem is here.
Yeah, I had a picture where they have so much market power, they're willing to sacrifice profits for ideology. And you're suggesting that they don't have to sacrifice profits for ideology. The choice facing consumers is either to watch what they put in front of you or not watch anything at all. And since they can sort of rely on consumers to watch something, they can just continue collecting their subscriptions and feed consumers whatever they think consumers ought to be seeing.
Or people are checking out. I mean, streaming is not a very good business model, right? Like by breaking the markets, they've destroyed the feedback loops. And, movie theaters are having really serious problems because people don't want to go to movies anymore. And I think the quality of the products that are being produced is lower. And it's not because people are less creative. It's just because there aren't feedback loops. So they have immense market power. And they are crushing, they are like going into the suppliers and reducing their compensation. But it's like, all of the good IP for reality shows is now coming from England. So like most of the good, most of the show, I think like American Idol, The Voice, all those, that's originally British IP. And that's because they imposed a similar, like a financial syndication rulemaking for independent producers in England vis-a-vis Channel 4 and the BBC, and there are no IP right restrictions on what those producers can make, and so they're able to make money and profit. In the US, it's like if you're a producer of a show, an independent producer, you go you can go to 4 or 5 streaming networks and they'll be like, if you want to get onto our network, you have to give up all the IP. We're going to pay you a specific fee. There's very little that you can do. It's not a very good business. And so the amount of creativity that's going into our cultural sector has collapsed. And you can say, yeah, man, Netflix is still, they're collecting it. You know, they're these greedy, all-powerful monopolists. They're not that smart, right? They're just people, and they're destroying Hollywood. Like, it's not that they are like that they're doing that well. You know, Disney's kind of in crisis, even though they've consolidated. That's kind of the problem. It's like when you consolidate power, it's not that you make a ton of money. It's that like the underlying operational capacity degrades. It's like Boeing. They consolidated the entire aerospace industry. And then you have the 737 MAX fiasco, and they can't make a good airplane anymore, right? This is ultimately like the main, not the main crisis, but one of the problems with consolidation is that you pool risk. And all of a sudden, like, if you don't have to produce good quality products, then you stop producing good quality products. And so it's like, it's very Soviet, right? You central plan, and then eventually you lose the capacity to actually produce quality products. So that's like, I'm not, you know, I think people feel a sense of unfreedom, and they feel that like their cultural priors, like cultural stuff is being imposed on them. And I think that that's true. But the broader dynamic here, it's like, Quentin Tarantino or Martin Scorsese are like, there's no great cinema anymore. And I think that that's a function of these broken markets. All Marvel movies, all stuff that China wants.
So it's a fascinating perspective on the causes and character of our unfreedom today, our lack of freedom today. It still doesn't quite feel like the right or the complete explanation to me. So let me try to get at it with my skepticism with a sort of anecdote. When I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska. Fairbanks, Alaska is kind of small town America. You go there now, it's a sea of MAGA hats. You know, when I was growing up, it was guns, trucks, and churches was the cultural world I grew up in. And I went to an academic summer camp. My parents sent me to an academic summer camp on the East Coast. It was the first time I'd ever met sort of the quote unquote coastal elites.
Right.
I was just 13 maybe. Mm-hmm. And I remember meeting a young man, also 13, and we fell into a discussion, and he was insisting passionately, his eyes were aflame with the fire of zealotry, that the only reason that women couldn't lift as much in Olympic lifting competitions as men was because society had told them that they shouldn't be that strong. Or the only reason women couldn't jump as high as men and dunk the way Michael Jordan dunked was because society had told them not to jump that high. And I was saying, no, there are biological differences underlying these physical differences. And he said, no, it's all cultural. And I remember it was getting so abstract. I was like, well, if force equals mass times acceleration, and if you imagine that men are on average more massive, then, you know, I was making these abstract, like an attempt to convince him with physics. It wasn't happening. He had a certain perspective, which was in fact a sort of early version of a very familiar kind of, and a juvenile version of a very familiar kind of identity politics that's quite pervasive in culture in some form or another. What it seems to me has happened is a set of ideas which he was exhibiting in a very juvenile form, an adolescent form, has become widespread, a sort of lens on the world that says the most important thing politically is the identity group you're a part of and whether an identity group is being oppressed or not. And I'm going to sort of process politics through that lens. I'm going to judge things. My judgments of reality and of justice are going to be made through that lens. So that particular lens, you know, started in a relatively small segment of society, and what it's essentially done is spread. I find it hard to see his ideology as an outgrowth of economic power. He was just a 13-year-old boy who had grown up in a family and a cultural milieu where he had been taught to think certain things. tell me if I'm missing something. Was to me, it seems like what you actually got was an ideology that started in a sort of segment of the educated American elite, sort of a segment of the good universities, spread and became something like a class consciousness, and is really operating. I mean, the same people who hold the ideology also have control of market institutions, unsurprisingly, because they are the educated. And it's culture driving material conditions, not material conditions driving culture. Am I wrong? Was that Boy's ideology and the spread of that ideology through more and more parts of society, in fact, in ways that were not apparent to me, still aren't apparent to me, the product of consolidated private power?
Well, so, okay, I actually think that ideas come first before, like, I'm not a vulgar Marxist type. I don't think that material conditions drive culture. I think that ideas drive the way that we drive material conditions. Like what I wrote in Goliath was about, and what I believe is that really people rethinking what it means to be a citizen, how our society should work, and making these political arguments ultimately shaped how we do commerce. Not that commerce changed and then we had all these cultural, we have these cultural attitudes as a result. So I think a lot of the social problems that we feel are downstream from consolidations of economic and political power. But the consolidation of economic political power existed in the minds of thinkers and activists as a goal before before they were manifested in reality. I don't think it was like a group of malevolent lobbyists that did it. That, the Aaron Director in the 1950s is an important law and economics guy. He thought this is what we need. And John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a left-winger, a whole series of sort of quasi-socialists believe this as well. They were like, look, we need to consolidate economic political power because that's the best way to run a good society. They had different views of why that was, but that's what they believed. So I don't think, when you're talking about like these kinds of cultural questions, that it's like this is driven by material interests or anything. I think like it's the counterculture, the part of what I was writing about in my book, the reason the left flipped is because there's a great essay by a guy named Leo Marx who wrote about the changes of the American Studies program at Columbia University. Mm-hmm. And it was called Believing in America. And what he talked about is, the left, right, had built this idea that came out of this notion of America as an egalitarian experiment. So in the late 1930s, the quasi-communists who fought on the side of the anti-fascists in Spain, they called themselves the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. Right? So as the quasi-communists, they were like, we're going to name ourselves after Abraham Lincoln because they associated themselves with America and with the fight against slavery, right? And with an Americanism. And he said that is what, and he wasn't a communist, and the people that created the American Studies program at Columbia, they weren't communists, but they came out of that was that same tradition saying that egalitarianism is the basis of, and left-wing ideas that is associated with Americanism. I believe in America as an experiment and as a mechanism to achieve liberty for humans. And what he argued is that in the 1960s, because of a variety of intellectual and political changes, the betrayal over the Vietnam War, civil rights advocacy, but more it was the betrayal of the Vietnam War, and new thinking in the counterculture said, in fact, American institutions are malevolent. American institutions, rather than being a mechanism for promoting liberty, they are a mechanism for suppressing sort of the idea, like marginalized communities, which is a very different way of thinking about it. The idea, like the early civil rights leaders said, we can use American institutions to liberate ourselves. The flip, to say American institutions are inherently oppressive. And therefore, they started using Enlightenment rhetoric, which had been associated with American institutions, to just that same American rhetoric, except it was, let's not focus on American institutions anymore. Let's focus on marginalized groups. This shift from thinking about political economy, political economic history to cultural history. And that's where I think a lot of and then once you just start saying, well, we're not going to have this universal human value element. We're going to just say that focusing on universal human values is, and the institutions that can promote that, that's oppressive. We're going to look at marginalized communities and sort of cultural. Those are the only actors in history. That, I think, produces this sort of the intellectual incoherence that was at the heart of that 13-year-old's point of view. It's not any different than like the Jacobins in the French Revolution, this idea of perfecting man. And in many ways, it's very libertarian. The idea, this romantic sense that you don't need to think about power, that all problems and all inequities, all problems and all issues, conflicts among human beings can be wished away. And we just need to just say, well, no, there aren't necessarily biological differences. We can wish it away. We're just romantics. That romantic sensibility is, I think, it's the same thing that facilitated a lot the ideas behind this consolidation of power. I also don't think that that attitude is pervasive. I think there's a brittle, small elite that I think you can find on the right and the left that likes to fight with each other and has control of our political and economic institutions. That's very annoying, and can impose elements of social control. But like most people don't think that men and women should be able to lift equal amounts. Like that's clearly stupid. And you could just I'm sure you'd find 95% polling showing that that's not what people actually think. It's this thin encrusted activist sort of political and economic elite that likes to fight over stupid things like this. That is the problem. And that, I think, is associated with these ideas of these largely romantic ideas of consolidating economic and political power for efficiency's sake, because they believe you can just sort of wish away politics in this kind of crazy romantic sense. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my...
It does, in an interesting way. I'm particularly interested in the part of it that has to do with a set of ideological attitudes or cultural formations that are happening in a very narrow band of the American elite. It might be as few as a few 100,000 people, for example, in a country of 300 million, where that elite has so much power over our cultural, economic, and social institutions. Their preoccupations become sort of the stuff of public life in our country instead of the things that are of interest and concerning to the other 299 million people. So
I would also say that I noticed so I'm sensitive to this because I'm in the progressive world, and I noticed a really significant change after the 2021 election when Glenn Youngkin won in Virginia. All of a sudden, people realized, the most aggressive people pushing this sort of way of thinking, a kind of anti-universalist thinking, that this stuff wasn't popular. Voters don't like it, and it's not that it's not that that this is unpopular, just among certain demographics. It's like every demographic thinks that a lot of this stuff is stupid. And so when that happened, when Glenn Youngkin won, I noticed there was this tremendous, pullback. And then, a lot of the institutional trends are still there. And
maybe
these
in your world, not in universities.
In universities, they're pretty insulated. But I think I do think this stuff is getting pushed back, and it will continue to get pushed back. But the more insulated you are, universities are really insulated. The less, this is again back to populism. It's it's hard to find a more insulated place than a university, except maybe the Federal Reserve or something like that. The more you make these institutions responsive to public concern, the less you'll have this obnoxious, these obnoxious attitudes being pervasive and taking control.
So, I was stressing previously our areas of disagreement, my skepticism of some of the economic explanations, but I think this might be a really important area of agreement. Let me try to explore it a little bit more. It seems to me that the cultural and institutional factors that are contributing to my and other sense of being unfree has to do with an elite phenomenon where a relatively narrow elite has a shared consciousness and has control of a lot of institutions. So what I'm thinking here is essentially an elite, not in just the sense of how much money they make, but in the sense of an elite of education and cultural power. These essentially are the people who go to good schools, get professional degrees, and earn handsome 6-figure or 7 or 8-figure jobs and run institutions. They run things like law schools ultimately, or universities, or for that matter, hospitals or law firms, right? So this is the world of the economic and cultural elite and the institutions they control. And what's interesting to me is that within this milieu, this relatively narrow band of people, something that Marx would have easily recognized has come to be apparent, which is a class consciousness, indeed an international class consciousness, because you will find something very similar going on in the Israeli elite and the French elite. And I was just this summer, by chance, I was in Georgia, and I was talking with various Georgian lawyers. They're exactly the same as the American lawyers. They have the same preoccupations.
Like the country Georgia.
The country Georgia. Right. So what you have is a sort of a cognitive elite, you could say, or an educated elite. I'm not quite sure how you'd want to classify them sociologically, but they have a sort of common progressive vision throughout America and throughout the world. They're a relatively narrow slice of this country and of other countries, but they have a set of preoccupations around, for example, gender and gender identity, around sexuality and sexual identity, around race, other kinds of the things that used to be called identity politics. They have enormous, and here's where, my fixation on that phenomenon and yours really intersect. Because of consolidated power, this band of elite actors, an educational elite actors with a common moral vision, a progressive moral vision, and I should distinguish, it's not your version of progressive moral vision. It's not your progressivism. It's a different one. I don't even know what to call it anymore. The identity vision. They have enormous market power. They are the heads of institutions, including market institutions. They are the head of media companies. They're the heads of educational institutions. So they affect all of us through our children. And they have enormous market power. And they control political outcomes. So we're nominally a democratic country, but in a sense, the terms of discussion, the agenda setting, is being set by this, top 5%. And it leads me to a kind of populism. Like, if we could empower democratic majorities to resist these forms of elite control, we could make the country's politics about the things that concern most people, which would be not these areas of cultural warfare, but other things that are have to do with employment and health and other kind of prosaic concerns of ordinary Americans. What do you think?
Yeah, well, so I think that there's a lot of merit there, right? And one of the things that's been interesting to watch is how conservatives have started noticing that they don't like being discriminated against. And so they see this particularly in freedom of thought areas like speech, but also things like PayPal, making choices about how to, whether you can have an account based on like whether you're spreading misinformation or, and this is the DEI stuff. And it's like, as a left winger, what I would say is like, well, I'm glad you guys have finally noticed that there's, discrimination, right? But like, you can't pretend like this is just a conservative problem. There's immense discrimination in this country against all sorts of people. And you can look at, why is it that on most determinations of social power, what you have is a society that is split between Black people and everyone else. And it's like the things that you experience as discrimination or as annoying, being poor is like experiencing those things times 1,000. And there is potential common cause. Like if you don't like being discriminated against by banks because of, what you say about whatever ideas you have, like, well, what is it? Ryan Coogler, who was the guy that made Black Panther, like he went in to withdraw some money from a bank, and he's black, and the bank called the cops on him. Like, welcome to America, right? I mean, in a sense. And it's not that America is this deeply entrenched racist place. I don't believe that. But there's a lot of discrimination. And so one thing, I think one of the big problems that I have, the reason that this kind of group of people have so much cultural power over the moral conversation is because conservatives aren't offering a real moral alternative. They're just saying, we don't like what's happening to us. But they're not saying there's a broader issue here that has to do with equal rights, and let's talk about the things that are happening to these other groups of people that are really bad and in some cases much worse than what's happening to us. Let's come together in some sort of coalition and take this on. They're just saying, stop doing it to us. And that's not a compelling moral vision.
Can you start to flesh out the alternative moral vision? I mean, it sounds like you're working your way towards something, which would be a way of thinking about discrimination and fairness and power that is that says that what conservatives are experiencing, like if you're pro-life, maybe something bad happens to you at your job or in your university or something like that. Conservatives are experiencing that and are objecting. They need to have a more universal view of the problem of how power works in our society and how it can lead to discrimination and how to fix that. So can you help me see what that larger vision would be?
Yeah. So, what is the answer? So, okay, like you could find any number of examples, but Amazon had this problem, which was facilitating this problem, where teenagers who were suicidal would look for a specific chemical to take to kill themselves, and they would go on the place they could get it was Amazon, and they would go and they would buy it, and when they looked for it, Amazon would show, hey, this chemical is often bought with this guide to killing yourself and these other chemicals which help you, keep this down instead of throwing it up. Would you like to buy these all together? And I
had no idea.
It's horrible.
Insane.
It's horrible, right? And there was this lawyer who brought a case saying this is outrageous because Amazon wouldn't do anything about it. And the other, like Etsy and the other entities would. They took it down, right? But it's like this recommendation algorithm was just horrific, and a lot of wrongful death suits. But I remember I was just tweeting about this, saying this is like something that's a really big problem. And the response from conservatives was like, yeah, but Amazon's doing this like woke thing on blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, you got to figure out how to have a more universalist perspective here. Because the problems that you're facing, if you can't associate those problems that you're facing with problems that other people are facing, like the parents whose kids, killed themselves, then you don't have a compelling moral vision. That's an example. But there's like a billion different examples, like this railroad. There's a railroad sort of problem right now where the hedge funds that own the 7 railroad monopolies in the country are saying, we don't want to we want to continue to slash the number of employees we had. So we don't want to give our employees any sick days, because if we give them any sick days, then we can't manage the schedules that are all incredibly tight due to the capacity that we've taken offline. And like there's almost going to be a rail strike over it, which would paralyze the country. And this has been a problem for a year. We've known it's coming. And the Biden administration's been doing some things that are like, okay, not great. And Democrats have been saying things. And the Republicans have been completely absent. They have not said anything. They have no framework for saying, yeah, maybe railroad workers should get some sick leave. They just haven't said anything. And like the Taylor Swift, Ticketmaster fiasco, conservatives have said nothing. The problems with the airlines, where we bailed out the airlines and then the airlines turn around and treat us all like crap. The Republicans and conservatives have said nothing. In fact, when the Biden administration said, we're going to start doing something about junk fees and all these fees that airlines are charging, like they're charging $100 billion in fees now annually. And Biden said, these fees are outrageous just to even sit with your family. Like if you have a 2-year-old, the airlines are now charging people fees to like make sure that you have a seat next to your 2-year-old, like that kind of thing. And Biden sort of gives this press conference and says, these fees are crazy, these are outrageous, and they also hit people of color harder. And like, so what happens? Like Tom Cotton tweets, oh my God, he's even ascribing airline fees to racism. And then thousands of conservatives are like, oh, look at this. Look at how, woke this is. We like airline fees because, like that's a crazy way of thinking. So, and I think you see this with strikes against Amazon or anger against Starbucks. Where are the conservatives? Where is their vision of how to empower people who work for a living? Where is that? I don't see it. And I understand why there's so much reluctance to engage with the existing union infrastructure. That makes sense to me. But you have to have a vision that incorporates more than your narrow concerns if you want to govern a big, sprawling country with people that have lots of different concerns. And right now, I don't see that on the conservative side. I see some people putting up some ideas about, some broader sense here. But the anti-woke thing, to me, when I'm looking at it, there are some ways that can lead people to start rethinking their priors about libertarianism. But I haven't seen, it's just so hard for conservatives to transition from this is a problem that a woke corporation is putting on us to maybe the concerns here are broader than just the woke things that corporations are doing. Maybe when I walk down the street and I see a bunch of homeless people, that's a problem too. Like maybe there's a larger moral vision here. And I don't see that. And I think that the conservatives can get there, but the empowerment of this professional managerial class, which is a lot of people like to call it, is not because they have acquired these strategic choke points. It's because they have a moral vision, which I think is a flawed moral vision, but they're not facing a competitive moral vision.
Well, I'm just one member of a very big movement, but I'm fascinated to try to develop this affirmative moral vision in exactly the sort of larger scale that you're thinking about. So let's try it a little bit now. I agree with you. Conservative movement lacks a compelling moral alternative to the woke moral alternative, for lack of a better word. And it's got to be one that's bigger than just bad for us. It's got to be one that takes into account the challenges that other kinds of people are facing outside of the four corners of, religious people or pro-lifers or whatever feeling discriminated against. So, okay, I'm accepting all of that, taking it on board, and I want to try to think my way with you to pieces of this new moral vision. It seems to me that the common thread here is abusive or corrupt institutions. So, Matt, I am on board with your critique and fascinated by your suggestion that what the conservative or libertarian movement needs is an affirmative moral vision that is compelling to people and compelling to a broad range of people, takes on board a lot of concerns that are right now being neglected. It seems to me that the common thread in much of what we've discussed is a concern with abusive or corrupt institutions that are supposed to have one sort of mission and be executing on one sort of mission and are acting on others in ways that are sort of wrongful or oppressive, and they just have too much power as they do so. So, you've stressed at various points in this conversation, various private actors, businesses that are treating customers badly, engaging in various kinds of wrongful market power because they just have too much of it and are too able to sort of capture the regulators that are supposed to be controlling them. On the conservative side, people would talk about universities, for example, and universities being ideologically captured in fields that are supposed to be, exercises of expertise, actually having such a strong political valence that they're not engaged in neutral teaching and knowledge discovery, but something like a kind of partisan advocacy under cover of scholarship. Why can't we talk about Amazon and Boeing and Delta Airlines and Coca-Cola and the whole range of private businesses in the tech sector and outside it, alongside Harvard and Yale and Princeton and say they're part of the same thing. They're part of corrupt institutions that aren't serving the people that we the people that they're supposed to be serving. I mean, could that be the alternative moral vision that you're looking for and I'm looking for?
I think redistributing power is essentially, I think that's where the core moral common ground is, right? We need to redistribute power away from these elite institutions or make these elite institutions functional again somehow, and I mean, I was talking, like, the idea isn't to make Blackstone, which is a private equity group, or Apollo, it's not to make them go away, it's to make them boring. So they're not extractive, right, institutions. And I think that makes a lot of sense. It's just that we have, and there I think there is a there's a multiracial, trans-ideological coalition on behalf of people who are mad they couldn't get Taylor Swift tickets for either them or their, if they're a teenage girl or young woman, or if they're a parent, right? There's just like a lot of anger out there about this, but how do you hook that to a political agenda? I think that is the challenge, and I don't mean to make light of it. The Ticketmaster is a huge problem in kind of cultural control, right? That they actually have immense cultural control for live events, everything from rodeos to singers, country music, whatever. That's where I think we have to build out a kind of political coalition to address that. And I think that there's just such a huge obstacle there are lots of, I'll try to be positive about this. I think that there's just there's a lot of opportunity to do that. I think what we have to figure out is how can you get to a position where conservatives are comfortable with governing, right? Because what you find is there's tremendous, like, take this crypto meltdown, right? Which you can say many things about it, but I think what very few people like to concede is that Elizabeth Warren was right. Right? And very early on, she's just like, this is crazy stuff. Like, what is going on? This is just unregulated gambling. And I bring her up because she's particularly annoying and polarizing to conservatives. But she was correct about this and what she was essentially saying and what her basic framework, and she's the sort of one of the original founders of the anti-monopoly movement against too big to fail banks, is we need some sort of public governance here around finance, or else you get this kind of like crazy speculative nonsense. And where is the ability to come together and say, yeah, in fact, we need some sort of regulatory model to address this kind of like crazy consolidation of power? Instead, it's, what you see on the conservative side is an attempt to demonize the regulators, which is like that's just the wrong approach to it. And I think that that's what you see, like, in general. I bring this back to Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission, who is probably the most, if she were a conservatives would be like, she's amazing what she's doing, cracking down on big tech, trying to block mergers, doing investigations into all these firms. But because she's a Democrat, she comes from the progressive side of the aisle, there's this sense, oh my God, Lena Khan is overreaching. She's trying to control the entire economy. There's no specifics behind any of it. It's all just rumor mongering. And it's like, where is that coming from? If you can never trust any government institution that isn't controlled by conservatives, then what is, like, how can that be a sustainable political movement? If you can't look at the substance of what our governing institutions are doing, and you just have to say, well, we're just going to rely on our purely on our instincts and not on evidence. Like, that's not, we got to get beyond that and figure out how do you build some sort of institutional capacity on the conservative side to actually project power in a way that's not purely reactive.
So let's say that you, Matt, maybe me, Josh, a bunch of other people went out to try to encourage a moral vision and a political movement centered on empowering we the people through democratic governance to control a set of institutions seen as increasingly corrupt and powerful
Right.
and abusive. And those institutions were not just the shibboleths of the conservatives or the progressives.
Right.
It was universities along with big tech, along with big business,
Which I think is a winning. If conservatives were to figure that out, I think they would govern this country for 40 years.
Well, so that's my question. Do you think that's a compelling moral vision that would actually bring people along and could be politically sold?
Absolutely. Everybody feels that sense of unfreedom. They just feel it differently, right? And it's just that if you only speak to your narrow version of it, then what happens is you get like what happened in the midterms, which is people don't like Biden and they don't like what the Democrats are doing, but they didn't buy what the Republicans were selling because the Republicans were selling Social Security cuts. And it's like, Biden's a really unpopular president. Like, conservatives need to really rethink what they did in this election to like not overwhelmingly win, right? And it's not just, and when you talk to people about it on the conservative side, like we're in conversations that they're like, oh, it's ballot harvesting. Oh, it's, and there's all these tactical explanation. And I'm like, this is exactly what Democrats said when Obama got crushed in 2010. Oh, it was all these structural factors. Oh, it was not our fault. It was not our agenda. It was like, well, you got to rethink what you're offering. And I think that's the challenge. And again, it gets back to what is organized on the right. And largely it's this alliance between the corporatists who have strong institutions and strong views about the role of big business, and social conservatives largely through churches who are deeply aligned with the libertarian corporatists because they don't trust the government for their own. They're not particularly happy with big business, but they don't trust the government. And I don't know how to address this problem. I'm not a Republican. I mean, this isn't my world, and I'm a Democrat for a reason. But this is the challenge. I think there is an immensely popular vision saying, this was the New Deal architecture. This is in many ways, it's like what Reagan sort of did in the early 80s, is saying this set of bureaucratic Sovietized elites are causing problems for everyone. And what we need is to replace that system with a different system that brings in more popular feedback and has more of the public interest involved. And I think whoever figures that out first is going to run this country for 40 years. And I think that there are challenges on the Democratic side, which we hadn't really talked about, and I'm happy to go there. But there are significant intellectual and political challenges on the right, which I think are solvable. But it is a question of like this common moral vision and extending beyond one's own narrow concerns and connecting that to a broader problem.
So Matt, that's fascinating. I also think that's a great place to end. So thank you very much for your time. This was terrific.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And I really enjoyed talking to conservatives because it's a different point of view, I think a legitimate point of view. And I've always enjoyed, I shouldn't say always, but I since I've
Thanks
sort
for that honesty.
Yeah, no,
I appreciate your openness. I really do.
No, I really like talking to conservatives. I really think there's a tremendous opportunity. There was a lot of rethinking going on the right, and it's very exciting intellectually. So I wish you guys the best of luck on it. I think it's important for America that you guys get there.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Open Minds, a Freedom of Thought podcast series interviewing the people who bring courage and independent thought to the challenges of today. To learn more, visit freedomofthought.fedsoc.org.